The committee will come to order. The federal government handles a massive number of records and documents. These records build an essential account of the work that the government does for the American people, and they help our constituents get access to the benefits and the resources that they need. These records also serve as an aid to congressional oversight. They help us hold the executive branch accountable, ensure appropriate use of taxpayer dollars, and keep the federal government working well for the American people. That's why keeping accurate records is absolutely so important, and why it's such a big problem when federal agencies fail to do so. Government officials from administrations of both parties have mishandled federal records. In some cases, existing records retention rules were blatantly disregarded. In other cases, federal officials failed to create records of key meetings, used their personal devices for official business, and deleted messages that should have been saved. In the past few years, I've heard troubling reports of officials destroying documents on purpose. Our systematic challenges have to do with the increase in electronic records and the use of new technology. Our procedures need to be updated to account for social media, video conferencing tools, collaborative office systems, messaging apps that automatically delete key content, and other modern tools that our government uses each and every day. Today's hearing will help us examine and improve our system for keeping federal records. Our witnesses are experts in the field of records management and government transparency. They will help us evaluate federal agencies' compliance with record-keeping laws, as well as the reforms that we need to implement. Whether it's adapting to new technologies, making it easier to enforce the guidelines that we have in place, or committing more resources to records management, we can take steps to make this process work better. That's why I'm working on legislation that would update the Federal's Record Act, making our government more transparent, more efficient, and more accountable. I now recognize Ranking Member Paul for sharing his opening remarks.
In the prophetic words of John Adams from 1765, liberty cannot be preserved without a general knowledge among the people of the character and conduct of their rulers. Fast forward nearly 250 years, and the essence of Adams' assertion couldn't be more pertinent. As we convene today, we are at a crossroads, facing a critical question. How do we navigate the legacy of Adams' vision in our times? Rather than honoring its duty to operate with transparency and accountability to the American people, the federal bureaucracy has become adept at shielding crucial information from public scrutiny and congressional oversight, all while squandering substantial manpower and resources in the process. In recent years, the executive branch's obsession with secrecy has become even more extreme. Take, for example, the persistent efforts over the past 4 years by the federal government to obscure information from the American people concerning COVID-19. For 4 long years, dozens of agencies across our government have systematically obstructed my requests for information. Even requests that have now come jointly with the chairman have been obstructed. They've refused to disclose thousands of relevant records in their possession. Over 8 months ago, Chairman Peters and I sent a letter to the HHS requesting these 2 documents. This document, 250 pages, all redacted. It's not classified. This document, nearly 300 pages, all redacted. This is what the response of government is to our requests, to reasonable requests. These are non-classified requests, and the government is obscuring them from us. Last year, Congress unanimously passed a law requiring the declassification of records relating to COVID origins and the Wuhan Institute of Virology. In fact, today is the 1-year anniversary of that bill being signed into law by President Biden. Did the Biden administration adhere to this statutory directive? We've gotten virtually nothing. The answer, regrettably, is a resounding no. Instead, what we received was a paltry, unclassified summary appended by a classified annex. So the order to declassify things was given to us in a classified document. This pattern of evasion is not limited to Congress. Our witness today, Mr. Gary Ruskin of U.S. Right to Know, has filed 97 Freedom of Information Act requests and 25 lawsuits in his effort to obtain information from the executive branch, and he's probably been largely more successful than any of us in getting information from the administration. U.S. Right to Know is one of the countless organizations fighting for the disclosure of records related to COVID-19. Nearly all of the records concerning the origins of COVID have come from these groups obtaining court orders to force the executive branch to comply. That is disappointing that we have no voluntary compliance. It only comes from a court order. This is unacceptable. Every one of the federal FOIA officers should be at this witness table today telling us why they are costing the taxpayer thousands of dollars fighting records requests in court, spilling black reductions all over the pages that should be public, and obstructing our congressional mandate to perform oversight over the federal government. This obstructionism, typified by extensive redactions, bureaucratic red tape, and legal barricades, undermines the very foundation of our democracy. The importance of a transparent record system cannot be overstated. When the government cloaks its actions in secrecy, it fosters an environment of mistrust. Federal bureaucrats appear to have no shame in their efforts to evade freedom of information laws and withhold information from the public. For example, David Morenz, one of Dr. Fauci's top advisors, is accused of improperly deleting COVID-19 origins material and using his own personal email to avoid FOIA during the pandemic. How do we know this? Well, he admitted it in writing. Dr. Morenz's own emails show that he hides his NIH work from FOIA by using Gmail. In a September 2021 email, Dr. David Morenz wrote, "As you know, I try to communicate on Gmail because my NIH government email is FOIA'd constantly. Stuff sent to my Gmail gets to my phone, but not to my NIH computer." He's willfully telling people to break the law to avoid the Freedom of Information Act. If that wasn't bad enough, he even said he would delete anything that he didn't want to see in the New York Times, also against the law. It is imperative that we hold these federal agencies to a higher standard. The government has a constitutional duty to respond to our requests and provide adequate answers and access to records. Today's hearing will shine a light on the failures of our current public records and freedom of information laws. As we spotlight the shortcomings of our present public records and freedom of information statutes, let it be known that this is not a matter of partisan divide. It is a matter of principle, of upholding the constitutional rights of every American. Mr. Chairman, I hope to work together to identify serious reforms to bring transparency and accountability back to government. The American people deserve nothing less. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter the Dr. Morenz emails into the record. I also ask unanimous consent to enter into the record statements from 2 transparency groups and 1 investigative reporter, all working hard to obtain documents.
Without objection. Well, I look forward to working with you, Ranking Member Paul, on this issue. It's critical. It has been a source of frustration for both of us over the last few months. It is the practice of this committee to swear in witnesses. So if you would both please stand and raise your right hands. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated. Our first witness, Anne Weismann, is a public interest lawyer who has spent her career advocating for transparency and accountability in government. She served as the chief counsel at Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, an organization dedicated to fighting back against government misconduct. Prior to her time in the nonprofit sector, Ms. Weismann served as deputy chief of the Enforcement Bureau for the FCC and as an assistant branch director at the Department of Justice. She received her BA from Brown University and her JD from George Washington Law School. Ms. Weismann, thank you for being here today, and you are now recognized for your opening remarks.
Thank you. Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify once again about needed reforms to the Federal Records Act. The FRA is a critical component of government transparency and accountability, and provides the essential infrastructure for laws like the Freedom of Information Act. In 1950, Congress enacted the FRA to create a legal framework for managing federal records. The executive branch confronting Congress in 1950 recorded its communications and actions almost exclusively on paper, and digital media was still the stuff of dreams. Today, by contrast, every part of the federal government conducts business through electronic communications that range from government-issued email accounts and telephones to ephemeral messaging apps. And while in 1950, a document's destruction created a permanent hole in our nation's history, today digital documents typically leave a digital footprint that allows for their recovery. Unfortunately, our record-keeping laws have not kept pace. And just as concerning, the National Archives and Records Administration has demonstrated that it lacks both the will and, it believes, the necessary enforcement tools to compel agency compliance with the law. On multiple occasions, NARA has refused to act in the face of an apparent record-keeping violation. Despite language in the statute requiring the archivist to act through the Attorney General when the archivist learns that records are either being unlawfully removed or destroyed, NARA has insisted that obligation runs only to the unlawful removal of records. I believe the current language of the FRA imposes a duty on the archivist to initiate an enforcement action for the unlawful deletion of records. But to remove any doubt, Congress should add clarifying language, which the proposed amendment to Section 3106 would do. Congress should also require that every federal employee leaving government service certify their compliance with the FRA. This, again, is something I know this committee is considering. I would go even further, though, and require that a designated records officer at each agency certify annually that agency employees are complying with the statutory requirement to create and preserve their federal records. This affords a level of accountability and transparency that currently is not in the FRA and properly places the onus on agencies to monitor their employees' compliance with record-keeping laws. Congress should also impose an outright ban on the use of government employees using devices, private devices, and ephemeral messaging apps unless and until there is a system in place to automatically back up their content on federal record-keeping systems. The companies that create ephemeral messaging apps tout their ability to facilitate completely private discussions with no record or copy left behind through the automatic deleting function. Absent reforms like the one this committee is considering, we can expect continued and widespread use of these apps that are actually designed to evade record-keeping requirements. I also endorse the proposal to incorporate records management into performance plans. This sends a strong signal that record-keeping matters at all levels of government. Further, while I agree codifying NARA's capstone program makes sense, again, I would go further. Setting a floor too often results in that floor becoming a ceiling. The goal should be to preserve the maximum number of electronic messages for as wide a group as possible. Finally, as outlined in my written testimony, to complement and enhance these fixes, Congress should establish an administrative complaint process reviewable by courts in certain limited instances. This would remove the onus on NARA alone to administratively enforce the FRA. The Federal Records Act rests on the central proposition that government records, as the records of the people, play an essential role in creating a stronger democracy. But good record-keeping promotes more than abstract goals. It gives vitality to laws like the Freedom of Information Act by ensuring greater public access to agency records. We need more legislation like that which this committee is considering to ensure that the goals of the FRA are met. I look forward to working with the committee on these important issues, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Our second witness, Gary Ruskin, has spent nearly 40 years working to increase accountability in our government. He has led a number of key organizations, including the Congressional Accountability Project, Commercial Alert, and the Center for Corporate Policy. His writing has been published in a number of academic journals as well, as well as the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and The Nation. He received his BA from Carleton College and a master's degree from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Mr. Ruskin, thank you for being here today, and you may proceed with your opening remarks.
Sorry. Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, other senators, thank you so much for inviting me to testify today about federal records laws. In my testimony, I want to focus on our 4-year experience of investigating the origins of COVID-19 and what it says about our federal records laws and how they're failing the public. They badly need strengthening and updating. Over the last 4 years, at U.S. Right to Know, we've carried out an investigation into high-risk virological research and the origins of COVID-19. As a part of this investigation, we've filed more than 150 public records requests, including 97 Freedom of Information Act requests, or FOIA requests. To me, our investigation is a test case of citizens' access to government records. If we can't successfully use our nation's public records laws to investigate something as important as the cause of death for nearly 1.2 million Americans, then why bother keeping records at all? To me, well, during our investigation, we've seen that some federal agencies, especially the National Institute of Health and the Department of Health and Human Services, have showed a pattern of obstruction and stonewalling. This serves the public poorly, especially on a matter that touches so many Americans so deeply. Let me review some key evidence we have of federal agencies obstructing our federal records laws. In the course of our investigation of the origins of COVID-19, we've had to file 25 FOIA lawsuits covering 38 separate FOIA requests. We've had to litigate FOIA requests to 14 federal agencies and sub-agencies, including NIH, Departments of Defense, Education, Energy, Health and Human Services, State, FBI, USAID, and others. Why did we litigate so many times? Why did we have to? Well, because these agencies didn't comply with the deadlines in the public records laws or were obstructing those laws. For this to happen so many times is a sign that our records processes are failing the public. As Senator Paul was saying, at NIH, there's evidence that staff intentionally obstructed public records laws. Dr. David Morins was a senior aide to Dr. Anthony Fauci, the former director of the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Disease. In a September 2021 email, Dr. Morins wrote, "As you know, I try always to communicate on my Gmail because my NIH email is FOIA'd constantly. Stuff gets to sent to my Gmail, gets to my phone, but not to my NIH computer. Don't worry, just send to any of my addresses and I will delete anything I don't want to see in the New York Times." This sort of purposeful obstruction of federal records laws is an attack on the public's right to know what the government is doing with our tax dollars. There's also evidence that NIH and HHS established special review processes that have served to delay federal records related to COVID-19 and its origins. For example, HHS has stated that it created 4 additional layers of legal review for FOIA requests concerning the pandemic. NIH Director Francis Collins personally reviewed NIH FOIA productions prior to release, according to Jason Foster in Newsweek. Aside from being a deeply questionable use of the NIH Director's time, these records were also, his review of these records was also a conflict of interest because many of them concern his own conduct. Some agencies' delays have been in producing federal records have been extensive and hard to justify. For example, on November 8, 2021, we filed FOIA litigation against NIH for 9 separate FOIA requests related to COVID-19's origins. and virological research, including communications between the NIH and EcoHealth Alliance and the Wuhan Institute of Virology. NIH failed to produce a single record for more than 16 months after we initiated litigation. In another example, exactly a year ago today, as you mentioned, Senator Hawley's COVID-19 Origin Act was signed into law. The law requires the Office of the Director of National Intelligence to declassify information about potential links between the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the origins of COVID-19. We filed a FOIA request for those declassified documents, and 7 months ago and today, ODNI still has not produced any new records not previously reduced to the public. There are a couple of solutions that I'd like to talk about briefly. The most important is to limit the use of the 9 FOIA exemptions to when they're clearly in the public interest. That would be a tremendous reform to bring openness in government. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Ms. Weismann, in your testimony, you highlighted several important challenges to managing federal records. Should tell the committee just why it is so important to preserve these records appropriately. Perhaps you go a little bit more in depth from your opening comments. And more importantly, how does this benefit the American public? Why is this so essential?
These records are a critical part of our history, of our story. And they explain what the government has done and why it's done what it has done. Access to these records is absolutely critical for bodies like this committee and other committees in Congress and the public to hold our government actors accountable. And without records, that is simply not possible. They're also critical, as I've mentioned, for transparency laws like the Freedom of Information Act, which has as its backbone, if you will, records. I mean, records are the currency of democracy. They are the way we hold government actors accountable. And we have seen too many examples where, whether it's at NIH, whether it's at DHS, whether it's the Secret Service, we've seen too many examples where federal employees are either willfully or unwittingly avoiding or contravening their record-keeping responsibilities. And as a result, the historical record of what they're doing and why they're doing it is incomplete.
So why, in your opinion, Ms. Weismann, is the Federal Records Act lacking? And specifically, as you know, we're drafting a Strengthening Oversight of Federal Records Act. We've worked with you and have gotten your thoughts. But how do you think this bill, if passed, will address that problem, and why is it important for us to do that?
I think this bill has some really critical features that will address the problem. Number one, it requires as I understand it, it would require all departing employees to certify their compliance with the Federal Records Act. We've seen examples, I think, in the last administration, to very high-ranking acting level officials. It was discovered after they left that critical emails from a critical period had been deleted. If they had been required to certify upon leaving government that they had complied with their record-keeping responsibilities, that might not have happened, or there would have been some ability to hold them accountable for what they did. I think another provision that this committee is considering is to codify the capstone requirement. That's a program that NARA created that would require the email messages of a top level of agency officials at every agency to be preserved. And I think there has probably been inconsistent compliance with the capstone requirement. So I think this committee has the right idea to codify that requirement and extend it to all messages, including electronic messages. A huge problem has been the use by employees of either personal email accounts, personal phones, or ephemeral messaging apps, and these allow them to evade compliance with the Federal Records Act. This committee, I understand, is considering a provision that would ban that use unless they were backed up into a federal record-keeping system. And I think a big part of the problem, and I say this with a great deal of regret, is that the National Archives and Records Administration has simply not been willing or able to bring agencies into compliance with the law. I mentioned that they have a sort of tortured construction of the statutory provision that imposes on them a requirement to refer matters to the Department of Justice. And they are not well equipped. They don't have the investigative resources, for example, that the Department of Justice has, which is precisely why we think it's so critical that the obligation to make that referral be made clear. And again, my understanding is that the language that this committee is considering would do just that. So I think these are some of the provisions that would go a long way towards bringing a level of accountability that just isn't in the statute today.
Well, you mentioned in your testimony back in 2022, it was revealed that the Secret Service, along with the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense, had deleted text messages and other electronic records from their phones. With the reforms that you've just discussed and others in the bill specifically, would that prevent something like this from happening again in the future?
I believe it would. As I mentioned, those people, the departing employees would have had to certify, if the provisions of this bill were enacted, they would have had to certify that they complied with the law. And I think, you know, in the face of that certification, I like to think that government actors by and large, will do the right thing. The bill also, if Capstone were in place, it should have captured their emails as well. So that would have been another backup that, again, would have ensured that their emails were preserved. I think for the Secret Service employees, under the provisions of the bill this committee is considering, they would not have been able to use their phones, for example, or ephemeral messaging apps unless the agency had a system in place that automatically backed them up. So I do think that the provisions that this committee is considering could have made a real difference in very concrete ways.
All right, thank you. Ranking Member Paul, recognized for your questions.
I think I'll defer my questions and let Senator Johnson go ahead.
Very good. Senator Johnson.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, you asked why is the Federal Records Act not being followed? I think it's pretty simple. Administrations can ignore it with impunity. And why is that? Because Congress has allowed its oversight role to completely atrophy. This committee has allowed its oversight and investigatory capability to atrophy. That's the problem. So you can pass more laws, but until Congress steps up the plate and we accept our responsibility for doing this. I'll use an example. In June of 2021, because of FOIA requests, even though I'm sure other committees of Congress had been asking for these records, Anthony Fauci, or HHS, finally released Anthony Fauci's emails, about 4,000 pages. Within a week, Senator Paul, I think, joined me and 3 other members of this committee and requested those documents unredacted. Again, FOIA is subject to redactions. What is 7 different exemptions or 9, whatever. By the way, you never know whether those redactions are legitimate. We find repeatedly that they're illegitimate. They're not justified redactions, right? So going through the accommodation process, we asked for all 4,000. We got all 4,000 redacted. Again, Congress is not subject to those redactions. So through an accommodation process, we asked, okay, we want to focus on these 400 pages. We want to see them unredacted, or we want to get them. Well, they didn't give them to us. We could go down to a reading room, not make copies, but take notes. So we were able to review 350 of the 400 pages unredacted. That took a couple months. Now, since June of 2021, there are 50 pages of the Fauci emails. Okay, by the way, one of the exemptions they use frequently here is interagency, even though these emails are outside the agency. So again, completely fraudulent exemptions are being claimed. But I've asked the chairman to subpoena these records. I've asked the chairman of the Permanent Subcommittee investigation to assist me, use his influence with this administration to get Secretary Becerra to give us these records. We had Secretary Becerra before the Senate Finance Committee a year ago. I did the same thing. I showed him these last 50 pages. And by the way, the law that governs when 5 members of this committee ask for something, it's like a subpoena. The agency shall turn the information over to us. He hasn't. I asked him last week, why haven't you turned these over? They haven't even produced a privilege log telling us why to justify these redactions. So again, the problem here is we are not insisting that the administration honor our constitutional responsibility and authority to conduct oversight and obtain these records on behalf of the American public. That's the problem. Senator Paul, I appreciate, and Mr. Ruskin, I appreciate you talking about the Dr. Morin's email. We did not, by the way, get that email unredacted from NIH. That came through our investigation in the minority here. Senator Paul and I joined in this request. I'm not going to tell you from who because we want active investigation. And you start disclosing that, you start ruining your investigation. But we obtained that email in a document dump of 175,000 pages. Now, my staff was able to pull that email out of that haystack. And, of course, we've written to Secretary Becerra. Explain this. Give us more documents. We've, of course, gotten no response from Secretary Becerra. We've gotten no help from the majority of this committee in uncovering this. So again, we can be talking about more laws, but part of the problem, I used to chair this committee. When I took over the chair, the Permanent Subcommittee investigation, the majority got $1 million budget. When Senator Peters took over the committee, his budget was increased 15%, and he cut the budget of the Permanent Subcommittee investigation by about 26%. It hasn't been restored. We're still down about 16% of what it was. Now, we got how many million people in the federal government? Millions, right? You know how many staff members the premier investigatory body of the United States Senate has? We've got 5. So again, you ask, why is the Federal Records Act followed? Because Congress is not interested in doing investigations or oversight, certainly not the Senate. If it were, we would have a dramatically increased budget for the Permanent Subcommittee investigation. We would have the majority in what I would consider a completely nonpartisan investigation, trying to figure out where did this pandemic start? We'd be working on this in a bipartisan fashion. We would have already subpoenaed years ago all of the Fauci emails, rather than remain silent and not allow or not have the majority join the minority in trying to get this information. So again, from my standpoint, I think this is pretty clear. Mr. Ruskin, I do have a question for you. I want you to speak to the difference between FOIA and redactions versus congressional oversight, which really the only legitimate purpose for withholding things would be executive privilege, which is quite limited, right? Executive privilege only applies to communications with the president, not interagency stuff. So I mean, agency heads talking to each other, that's not executive privilege. It has to involve the president. Is that correct, Mr. Ruskin?
That's a correct description.
Microphone?
Yeah, I think that's correct.
Do you agree with my basic assessment here that the reason the administrations are getting away with this is they just learned over the decades as Congress has allowed its oversight ability to completely atrophy, that there's no penalty. There's none.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with your basic assessment that in general, over the last, say, 55 years or so, Congress's oversight of the federal government has declined, and that's really tragic. In addition, citizens' ability to do oversight of the federal government through the FOIA has been dramatically circumscribed just after the FOIA came into being, and that has continued on and continued to get worse. And so it's two problems together. As well, we have a dramatic lack of investigative reporters.
So, Mr. Chairman, if you're serious about this, subpoena these last 50 pages. Get on the phone with Secretary Becerra today and go, why don't we have these last 50 pages unredacted? And my guess is the reason we don't is as incriminating as the redacted emails were, there's some probably pretty juicy stuff under all those redactions. So again, join us, subpoena, use the power of this committee. Use our constitutional authority, demand that the administration turn over these records. Thank you.
Ranking Member Paul, I recognize for your questions.
On the heels of that, Senator Johnson, I can't answer to the subpoena part, and that's a decision the committee would have to make. But I can say that Chairman Peters and I have been on the phone with Becerra. We did request these, and he did chime in forcefully on it, and it is disappointing. They still haven't. Not only the documents you're looking for, what we're looking for. We passed a law unanimously to declassify all these things, and I tell people, because they don't quite get it, the declassified thing didn't work because it's already all not classified. What they're resisting, I mean, I'm all for it, and I think Senator Hawley did a great job with the bill, and I support the bill to declassify it. Most of what we're looking for is not classified, and yet they still resist. The two documents I have that are 250 pages are not classified. So what we have is just complete resistance and obstruction. But I do agree with your point that if we do reform of freedom of information, people don't want to have punishment, but if there's no punishment, they won't work. There has to be a punishment. So like Dr. Morenz, I'm still not sure if he's punished. Mr. Ruskin, do you know if David Morenz has been fired or suspended?
I don't know, but to my knowledge, no.
I mean, if you want to send a message throughout government, if someone blatantly says, and I guess this was gotten through FOIA. No, not through FOIA. You got some of this information on his email. We now know that he's evading the law by using his own Gmail and saying, I delete anything that's also against the law, that he would be punished and publicly punished to send a message throughout government. Ms. Weismann, do you know if do you know anything about David Morenz or if he's been fired?
I do not.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is the problem we have, and if we want to make it better, there's going to have to be something in the bill. If we put forward a bill, if we put forward more legislation, there has to be some penalties involved. I think without that, we're not going to get anywhere. I think one thing we could do maybe together would be to see if the chairman would make inquiries as to whether, was Dr. Morenz fired? Was he punished? Has he been suspended? I think I have seen somewhere in the press that maybe he's been suspended, but it's all sort of kept quiet. And because he can get away with this, and then the NIH still gets away with this, I think they think they're Teflon. They think they're completely immune. And it is disappointing because Senator Peters has signed now several letters, and one of them is probably 6 months old. And we're not asking for the secrets to the Manhattan Project. We're not asking for the atomic weaponry secrets. We're asking for NIH deliberations over what is dangerous, what is not dangerous research, and they basically have told Senator Peters and myself, go fly a kite. And I don't think this should be partisan. Somehow the whole thing got wrapped up and became partisan, and if you wanted to look for these records, you had to be part of this vast right-wing conspiracy. So I wanted to mention that U.S. Right to Know, I think, has done great yeoman's job on it, but I don't think you're part of the vast right-wing conspiracy. I understand you worked for Ralph Nader for over a decade. I'd just like you to clarify for the record, you're not part of the vast right-wing conspiracy, are you?
No, I am not.
And it's really, I consider this to be people from all walks of life, right, left, and others. But up here, it became partisan somehow. Somehow, if you we're looking into this, it was a Republican thing, and it doesn't need to be. And like on records requests, if our roles were reversed, I've told Senator Peters, I can't think of a records request I won't sign. But we still are having trouble getting these records, and we have to somehow more forcefully look for this. And the main reason I want to is not even just the culpability who's involved. I want to make sure this doesn't happen again. you know, that we don't have another virus leak that kills even more people. And the people who look at this say this isn't even the first time. There was a virus that leaked back in the 70s that caused a pandemic. It just wasn't as deadly. Not as many people died, but most people believe that it came from a lab because it had the exact same DNA as a virus from 1954. And it came out, and that doesn't happen because viruses evolve over time. With regard to the law on this, Mr. Raskin, do you know what the law is for violating, you know, the use of, you're supposed to use government email, not Gmail. Does the law currently say what happens to a person who blatantly flaunts the law?
So there is a provision, a criminal provision right now, Section 2071, if I remember correctly, that does prohibit the destruction of records. But it's kind of an old statute, and it's, you know, it's not modern. It doesn't really, it's not very clearly applying to these situations of ephemeral messaging apps or, you know, Gmail accounts.
Right, but even using Gmail is technically, is it against the law or it's
Yes.
against a rule?
Yeah, correct.
Ms. Weismann, are you aware of people being punished for using their personal email? Is it against the law? Is it a rule? Is it a recommendation?
I am not aware. I mean, I would argue that it does in fact violate the Federal Records Act because the act requires the preservation of records. And to the extent text messages, whether sent or email, et cetera, to the extent they qualify as records, they need to be preserved. But the problem, as I've mentioned in my written testimony, is that there aren't sufficient enforcement mechanisms in the Federal Records Act itself.
So basically, in the Federal Records Act, it may well say that it's illegal, but doesn't say what you do if someone breaks the law?
Correct. I mean, there are provisions that place the onus on the archivist to make a referral to the Attorney General. And of course, the Attorney General has a full panoply of mechanisms to enforce the law, but that enforcement authority is very rarely exercised. And so we're in a situation where I think agencies and agency officials and agency employees can basically flout the record-keeping laws with impunity.
Disappointing. That's all I have. I'll reserve my time.
So before going to Senator Hawley, so the Attorney General does have the ability to enforce, but it's simply not being used.
Yes.
Any
and-
suggestions of what we need to do?
Well, I think, again, I support what this committee is proposing, which is to clarify the language of the statute. I think it's Section 3106, that the archivist not only has the ability, but the responsibility to make a referral to the Attorney General when it comes to the archivist's attention that records are either being removed or destroyed. And you know, we need to see NARA more robustly endorse that role. And once a referral is made, the Department of Justice does have the ability, better than NARA, to conduct an investigation. There are criminal penalties. There are other things that NARA can do. I mean, that the Attorney General, there's replevin. You know, there are available enforcement tools, but they rest with the Attorney General. And we have to have a better mechanism to require NARA to bring attention to these problems. Because if NARA doesn't make a referral, how is the Attorney General supposed to know about a record-keeping violation?
Thank you. Senator Hawley, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. I want to start with the COVID Origins Act, which Senator Paul mentioned a second ago, and which I think is such a great case study in the failure of the federal government, the executive branch, to even comply with the law. I mean, forget being responsive to FOIA requests, although we'll get to that in just a second, but just to comply with the law. Mr. Ruskin, you highlighted in your written testimony that it was 1 year ago today, I think, that the president signed into law the COVID Origins Act, which, as Senator Paul pointed out, we passed unanimously here in the Senate. It passed in the House pretty close to unanimously. It passed on suspension. So that was a year ago. The administration, under the law, then, and by the way, you can read the law. It's very short. I wrote it. It is not an optional command. It is mandatory. It is, as lawyers say, precatory. It is you shall. They shall declassify any and all information relating to potential links between the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the origin of COVID. So, finally, late on June 23rd, they blew through the statutory deadline. The statute sets a deadline, as you remember, Mr. Ruskin. There's a deadline in the statute. The administration blew right through that deadline. And then late, in violation of the statutory deadline, they don't produce any and all information related to potential links. They give us a 5-page summary of information, which is in total violation of the statute, and then a cover page, so that's important, and then an appendix, which sheds no light on anything, for a grand total, I think, of 10 pages. I mean, it's a joke. It's a total joke. I immediately wrote to ODNI, Director of National Intelligence, and said, you're in violation of the statute. Do you want to try again and actually comply? Or maybe you'd like to come testify to this committee. I don't think, that was a year ago. I sent that on June 27th of last year. I just checked again this morning. I don't think I've ever gotten a response to that letter. I mean, it's basically the FU from ODNI. They don't care. They violated the statute openly. They don't even respond. They don't even bother to respond to the letters. They don't care. Now, you, Mr. Ruskin, you, I think, have filed a FOIA request for this same information. Is that right?
Yeah, we filed a FOIA request, and we filed FOIA litigation for it 7 months ago, and all we've gotten is the unclassified report.
Yeah. So, okay, you filed a FOIA request, and so far you've gotten zilch. Is that correct?
Yeah, with the litigation.
And then you went to court because they weren't complying with the FOIA request, and that was in August, I think, is when you went to court. Is that right? August of last year.
I think so. 7 months ago.
Yeah, August 10th, I think, of last year. And thus far, ODNI has, or any other, for that matter, arm of the federal government, they haven't engaged, they haven't complied, they've given you nothing other than their original report, which is flagrantly in violation of the law. Have I got that right?
You got that right.
I mean, this is just, I can't emphasize how absurd this is and what a mockery this makes of federal law, what a mockery it makes of oversight, and frankly, what disrespect it is for the American people. I mean, the reason that the president signed this into law, I'm sure he didn't want to, but the reason he did, and the reason it passed so overwhelmingly in both houses is the American people want to know what their government knows about the origins of COVID. And they have a right to know. As Senator Paul pointed out, much of this is declassified anyway, and yet they still will not make it available for public review. And despite the law, despite Congress, both houses of Congress and the president signing a law, they still won't comply. So let me just ask you this. I mean, in terms of next steps, what would you recommend, Mr. Ruskin? What do you think this Congress can do, this committee, Congress, can do to compel agencies to comply with federal law? Do you have any suggestions?
Well, I mean, I think oversight hearings like this are crucial, and, you know, you've got to do a lot more of them, and just, you know, fight for the ability, you know, on behalf of the American people to make sure that we all can read the documents that our federal government produces.
Do you think there ought to be penalties for federal agencies that fail to produce records that are required by statute?
I definitely think there ought to be, and I also think there could be some extra funding for agencies that do a good job at it.
Do you have any other suggestions for improving the system to get agencies to produce records? I mean, I've been rebuffed multiple times. You've been rebuffed multiple times. Senator Paul's been, everybody sitting in this committee has been stonewalled by, if not this administration, other administrations. Do you have any other suggestions for steps that we can take? Penalties, anything else?
I mean, it's not a specific suggestion, but this is a co-equal branch of government, and it's important for our members of Congress to act like that. Yeah,
that's good advice, and we do need to start acting like it. Well, I thank you, Mr. Ruskin, for what you do. I thank you for the litigation you carry out on behalf of the public's right to know. In this case, just to comply with federal law. I mean, here the law actually requires the disclosure, and we're getting absolutely nothing. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for holding this hearing. I would just humbly submit that I think maybe it's time to call the Director of National Intelligence and any others and have an oversight hearing about their total failure to comply with a law that we passed unanimously out of the Senate, and that the House passed overwhelmingly, and the President signed into law, and they've made zero effort to comply with it in any meaningful way. Thanks to the witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. Senator Johnson, I know you had a comment.
Just a real quick point. You know, I understand the talk about classified versus unclassified for public disclosure, but again, I want to point out, you know, we have security clearances. It doesn't apply to us. So that's not an excuse for the administration not to turn classified material over to us that we can read in a skiff. And then again, if we don't agree with the classification, we can work with the administration, try and get things declassified. But it's not an excuse for the administration to withhold documents from Congress, who has the constitutional authority. Why is it the administration gets to keep all the secrets? They can't keep all the secrets. They shouldn't be allowed. So again, it's not about classification. That's in terms of public disclosure. When it comes to congressional oversight, it should have no bearing whatsoever except for a very limited amount of highly classified information that we're not even privy to. Thank you.
Thank you. Ranking Member Paul for a comment.
And just following along this train of thought, how does Congress force the administration to give up information? How did it work historically? Well, once upon a time, what would happen is the chairman of the appropriations for HHS would call the White House, and they would simply say, you give the records or you quit getting money. And that had maybe at one point in time more bipartisanship, that it was us against them. It was the legislature and the people versus the executive branch. And the power of the purse still could be used, but it's never used. But the power of the purse could be used. And I'm not saying this is a partisan thing, because I think some on the Republican side have been unwilling to use it also, because some of the records you wanted to get when you were chairman of the committee, when we were in the majority, and you struggled to get, you could have gotten much easier if the chairman of appropriations, Republican, would have said no more money. And so I would just argue that it's part of this larger debate we're having over the power of the purse. The power of the purse is we don't give money to these agencies that have grown so large unless they give us information. Almost everything I want is unclassified already. I want to know the deliberations. When Anthony Fauci said that all of his scientists up and down the chain said that this is not gain of function, that this is not dangerous research that was going on in Wuhan, I want to see the deliberations. There's a meeting at NIH, periodic meeting, called the Dual Use Research of Concern / Gain of Function meeting. They discuss whether something's gain of function and whether it should be referred to another security level, to the P3CO committee for review. Well, that didn't happen because Anthony Fauci says we all discussed it and we said it wasn't gain of function. That deliberation, the deliberations over what is gain of function and what isn't, should be public knowledge, because they made a mistake. The research was incredibly dangerous, and we got a pandemic because of that. Someone made a judgment error. Someone judged this research to be safe, and it didn't have to go to the safety committee for review. That's what needs to happen, and not just to pass a judgment on them. Maybe there was a debate, and there were two scientists on one side and another on the other, but we have to learn from that debate because they failed to recognize how dangerous that research is. But I can't get that information. I don't think anything at the NIH, there may be classified stuff, but it's not. And back to Senator Hawley's bill on declassifying this, we are aware that there is an enormous amount of biological research in the defense apparatus of our government, and it didn't come across in 10 pages. So there wasn't even a touch of any of that. And so I think we are still being stiff-armed, and I hope we can get bipartisan cooperation, but I think we have to have penalties in there. If you just tell them what to do, they will ignore it. So they have to take their money or take their job or punish them financially if they're breaking the law. Thank you.
Ms. Weismann, after June of this year, NARA will no longer accept executive branch records in paper form. Could you explain the magnitude of this policy change and the challenges that it poses to NARA and, quite frankly, the rest of the executive branch?
Yes, I don't have precise numbers. I did read recently an estimate that as of a few years ago, on a daily basis, government employees sent or received over 1 billion emails. That's a day. And that's one form of record. Now, obviously, all emails are not going to qualify as records that need to be preserved, but I think it gives you a window into the magnitude of the problem, which really is enormous. NARA is going to be faced with ingesting billions and billions of records and put in digital and electronic form. And its job is going to be complicated by the fact that there are still some agencies who follow a print-to-paper practice, which means rather than storing their electronic messages, their emails electronically, they print them out and put them in a paper file. The technological capabilities of agencies differ widely. They don't all use the same technology. And the technology has, different capabilities at different agencies. Agencies historically have not worked, their record-keeping people don't cooperate and coordinate with the IT people. So typically at an agency, there's a real disconnect between the record-keeping people and the technology side of the agency, which is going to complicate NARA's job enormously. They just don't have a uniform way, agencies, of capturing and preserving these records. I think it's fair to say that without money and other resources, I don't see how NARA can perform this, statutorily prescribed job. It needs more people and it needs more money. And without that, I think it's probably doomed to fail because this is such an enormous undertaking.
So resources obviously always needed as you're dealing with the volume that you're speaking about, but you also need some technological advancements. Are there things out there that the government could be using that's available but we're not?
My understanding, and this is definitely not my area of expertise, is that AI, this is an area where AI may be of some assistance. I certainly think it's something that NARA should be studying and looking for ways to improve the way of ingesting and maintaining these records. I do think that agencies have to be brought into the 21st century with the framework they have for creating and preserving these records as well. And again, I know this is a difficult thing to tell Congress, but I think that also means more money for agencies to upgrade their technology.
Great, thank you. Mr. Raskin, certainly you've spoken quite a bit about the importance of government transparency, and you brought up a number of issues related to FOIA, which I think is important. And in addition to having access to these records, which we obviously need, which is a serious issue that we want to address, it's still important to have good records management by the agencies. You got to start with good records management. Then you have the access to it, which is necessary for us to provide our oversight function. But talk about that. Why is a Records Act that modernizes and strengthens the keeping of these records, which is our attempt in this legislation we're proposing, why is that so important for FOIA? Why do we have to do that?
Well, it's so important.
Give me the mic.
It's, hello? Okay, yeah, it's so important because first, this is how we citizens hold our members of Congress accountable, is by, and our entire federal branch accountable, is by reading these documents, and our journalists read these documents, and that's how we know who's done well and who hasn't. Public trust in our government is in decline right now, and there's so much partisanship, and so the ability to keep federal records and to produce them when citizens want them and need them is crucial to public trust and crucial to increasing public trust at a time when our government is having troubles with trust. And so for these reasons, also historical reasons, we citizens ultimately in this country are in charge, and in order to be in charge, we need the documents that our federal government produces in order to make decisions about how we as a people will govern ourselves.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And first I want to thank Ranking Member Paul for holding this hearing with me today. I'd also like to thank both of our witnesses. We look forward to continuing to work with both of you as we work on legislation to strengthen the Records Act. Preserving federal records is critically important. Accurate records allow us to maintain transparency, to protect our nation's historical record, and also ensure that the federal government is working for the American people each and every day. As today's witnesses explained, the laws and systems we use to preserve federal records are outdated, and it requires congressional action to change that. And that's why I'm working on legislation that will modernize our record-keeping practices. It'll strengthen enforcement of our record laws, which is absolutely critical, and Ranking Member Paul and I are in agreement with that, and bring our policies up to date with emerging technologies, whether it be AI or other systems that can help us manage the massive amount of data that is being stored. My legislation would prohibit federal officials from automatically deleting records from disappearing message application. It also expands congressional insight into violations of federal records law, and it will require NARA and federal agencies to take additional steps to recover lost records. If we advance this legislation and provide NARA with the resources it needs, I believe that we can address many of the issues that were discussed here today. This record for this hearing, will remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on April 4th of 2024 for the submission of statements and for questions for the record. This hearing is now adjourned.